Chapter 450, The Iode Strike Oil. Sunday, December 1, 1996, Cactivacarctic National Wildlife, Refugilus United States of America Atlantis, DEFCON status. 346%. Next up. Theological implications of an afterlife. Chief Lidu of Atlantis had never thought that he'd have ranged this far away to establish a new colony. Then again, he'd never thought that his people would have the opportunity to visit an area outside of that island of theirs. Fortunately, now that the statute of secrecy had fallen and that the Muggles were aware of the half-giant population, the Iode were able to travel a little more freely. The original island had been quite overcrowded at the time the statute of secrecy had fallen. Inevitably, people had figured that this would be a good chance for the half-giants to establish small towns and hamlets further south, where the weather was warmer. A large community had been established around the shores of Great Bear Lake, making sure that they didn't encroach on lands visibly occupied by Muggles. However, several of the leaders in the Senate had figured that they should take the opportunity to explore a little more and settle more unoccupied territories. The exodus from Atlantis had been slow at first. However, it had begun to accelerate as the temperature dropped and daylight became harder and harder to come by. Eventually, the sea surface froze over, and people were making their way south by crossing the icepack, as well as traveling through the forest. Litu, with his wand at the ready, had led his band of 100 hardy colonists on a trip to settle the coastal range to the west of Great Bear Lake. Explorers had mentioned a large area chock-full of wildlife, most of which seemed edible. Unlike most of the places they had settled so far, this location was technically part of the American state of Alaska. This meant that they would have to petition the American government if they had to deal with any Muggles in the area they planned to live in. Rubeus Hagrid, the British ambassador to Atlantis, didn't think that the Americans would have a problem with people settling in remote corners of Alaska. He was the local expert on America, as he had spent some time serving as a zookeeper in the capital. The Americans are fairly reasonable people, Chief, perfectly friendly. I'm sure they'll be fine with it. Besides, as far as I know, the entire area is just covered with trees and no one lives there. As it turned out, there were a few people up here. Shortly after reaching the coastline, they had stumbled onto an Inuit community known as Cactivic. The locals had been astonished to see the train of tall men making their way towards the shore. They had been even more surprised when they realized how tall the people actually were. Litu had discovered that some of them had thought that they were guards of some sort, while others thought that they were people known as Big Feet. Thankfully, these people spoke English and Inuit, so Litu didn't have trouble talking to them. He explained that he and his band were trying to find a place to settle down, as it was a bit too cold for them up north. The natives' response, however, took Litu by surprise. Apparently this was a protected area, and the United States frowned on new settlements up here. So the natives came up with an interesting proposal: live with them as residents of Cactivic. There's a lot of open space up here. You can build your homes just outside ours. Big guys like you should be good for dealing with threats like polar bears and so forth. Have you ever hunted whales, seals, and walruses before? Litu nodded. We're originally from an island further north. We have to eat a lot, and whales are part of that. The mayor grinned. You'll be able to help us a lot then. Are you guys good with harpoons? Some of us are, Mr. Mayor. However, I'm a wizard, and I find it much safer to cast spells at them. We may be big, but whales are a hell of a lot bigger. Litu talked with the mayor for about half an hour and then turned to the rest of his men, who had been waiting a few houses or so away as to not frighten the locals. All right, guys, here's the story. Believe it or not, the area around here is a protected reserve, and the United States doesn't like people settling up here a lot. However, this community had been grandfathered in. As a result, they have offered to let us live with them. One of the colonists frowned. Are you sure that's a good idea? I thought we were supposed to keep away from Muggles. Something about us competing for resources, that type of stuff. And we don't want any international incidents with Canada or the United States so soon after we came out. Litu grinned. We'll be helping them gain many more resources. The polar bears see ordinary humans as easy targets, but they'll find us much harder to deal with. Our arrival will likely provide them with a lot of meat, and the fact that I'm a wizard will make things much easier for the locals. Besides, providing for 250 ordinary humans isn't going to tax us much, considering that we eat a hell of a lot more than a typical human does. A second colonist scratched his head. What are they doing up here to begin with? Without magic, they must get awfully cold. There used to be a military facility here back in the 1950s. That's all that left of it. It's now defunct. The first Iade gawked at Litu. Someone was going to invade here from the Muggle world. Who were the expecting, angry whales? Litu grunted. Nuclear weapons. Decades ago, Russia and the United States were enemies, and people were concerned that they would shoot nuclear weapons, the ones from Judgment Day, at each other. This facility was to look for missiles headed towards the United States. The second Iade scratched his beard. If the military facility is gone, what are they doing here? Litu shrugged. Once they settled and built houses, they probably didn't want to leave, which leads me to my next question. Do we stay or go? If we stay, we'll have to send back a message saying that this city will have to be under joint Iade/American jurisdiction. On the other hand, we'll get a chance to interact with Muggles. Let's vote, and when you vote, think carefully about how your family would react to living in this area. The colonists debated it for a little while, and eventually decided to go somewhere else. They didn't want to get into a fight with the Muggles, and several of the people who would be joining them. If everything went as they hoped, a few thousand might not be as eager to deal with Muggles as the first colonists were. Finally, they didn't want to be seen as invaders taking over an American city and making it part of our tallies. The mayor was a bit disappointed, but he understood the half-giant's concern and recommended some other places further east, near the border between the US and Canada. A few days later, well out of the Muggles' foraging range, they decided that they had discovered a good place to settle. There was a lot of food around, and the area was beautiful. They were also right on the water, so they would have an ample supply of fish if they managed to smash their way through the ice on top. Litu nodded, brought out his wand, and began magically unpacking all their equipment. Most of the people got to work starting to erect buildings, pitch tents, and plant the Iade flag in the permafrost. However, a few people decided to look around the area to see if there was anything else of note other than trees. As it turned out, there was. Litu looked in amazement at the sample one of the explorers had brought back. "What is that black goo? Where'd you find it?" The explorer grinned. "I found it coming out of the ground in a forest somewhere, in the shadow of some trees. Believe it or not, there are areas up here where the trees are so thick there isn't much snow on the ground. At any rate, this goo is a good supply of energy, and it can be used in torches." Litu nodded. "Interesting discovery. I wonder if the Muggles could use it. I know it may come in handy for us, but we have to remember that if the Muggles need a resource, they should get first dibs on it. We're on their territory, after all." The explorer frowned. "I don't think we need to worry about it, Chief. There are no Muggles up here using it." "What about the people in that village we saw? Could they be using it? We don't want to steal their stuff." "I'd argue that it's a bit unlikely. We didn't see any evidence of downed trees or trails in the area. Unless those Muggles flew here, they've likely never seen it before." Litu made up his mind. "All right, Martu, here's what we'll do. Tell me where you found that stuff. We'll wait a week, and if no one from the Muggle village comes to claim it, it's ours. We'll then start trading it with the Muggles. Fair enough?" Martu nodded. "Works for me, Chief. I'll see if I can go back and get more of it." "Good idea. Oh, one more thing. Which side of the border is it on? Do we need to talk with the Canadians or the Americans?" Martu shrugged. "Beats me I didn't see any signs saying welcome to Canada. If I had to guess, I'd say the United States. I doubt it will matter, though. What are they going to do, invade us because we stole their black goo? Litu smiled. Yeah, right. Here, let me see that. I wonder if it would make a good spell component. Chapter 451. Theological Implications of the Afterlife. Monday, December 2, 1996. Omega Institute Heimbeck, United States of America Atlantis DEFCON status. 346% next up. No love boat John Paul Roman II didn't know which of the latest developments was more disturbing. All he could say was that things would have been much different had development, one taken place before Judgment Day. Confronted with incontrovertible evidence that large numbers of giants were congregating in and around the city of Gath in the Gaza Strip, the Israeli government had finally asked the fledgling community to explain its actions. The giants' response had taken the world by storm. They planned to re-establish the ancient free city of Nephilu back on land, which the giant took to be their native soil. Although it was true that the Middle East had always been discussing two-state solutions, having a second state run by giants hadn't exactly been what the peace brokers had had in mind. Large areas of Gath had been built up seemingly overnight. Most of them were flying an unusual flag that no one had seen before, a white fist on a green background holding a sword and an olive branch. Samuel's jaw had dropped when someone had pointed it out. He said that it was the flag the Nephilu had used in biblical times, and it hadn't been seen in this part of the world in millennia. The Nephilim insisted that there would be freedom of religion in the city and that Muggles would be welcome to live in it. There would also be swift justice in case any fighting broke out, a claim that the giants had already shown to be plausible. The Palestinians had cheered the giants' declaration and said that they would welcome the giants as neutral law officers. The Israelis, however, had complained that they had enough problem dealing with the Palestinians. They didn't need giants getting involved in the region as well. The Nephilu ambassador had apparently been expecting this comment. Grinning fiercely, he had explained that the Nephilu had the right to settle in the area under the Israelis' own right of return. He argued, quite reasonably in Samuel's opinion, that the community in Ethiopia was in fact a group exiled from Israel by David and his descendants in the 10th and 9th centuries BC. If the Israelis were allowed to return to their ancestral homeland, why weren't the Nephilim? The Israelis had been caught completely off guard by this claim and didn't seem to buy it all that much. However, the thought of 13-foot-tall walking mountains stepping on their houses caused them to protest less strongly than they otherwise would have. Supposedly, the declaration had even caught several members of the Israeli Ministry of Magic off guard. Apparently, the Nephilim had originally been brought in to serve as peacekeepers in the Gaza Strip. Had they been planning on recreating a small independent city-state in Gaza the whole time? If so, had they realized how that could influence Middle Eastern politics? The Pope didn't have time to think about this, however, because of other issues which had come to his attention. There were rumors that the entire Omega community was going to leave the Rhinebeck campus and head off to Costa Rica. The reason was twofold. First, Christians for Humans was planning to attack the campus, and the conference attendees didn't want to be there when that happened. And second, the fact that it was getting very cold up here. Everyone would have to pack up and make their way down there over the next few weeks. Samuel had finally admitted that he would not be able to unify the Abrahamic faiths. However, at least he could suggest a philosophy that Abrahamics could follow, a way of life which would make sure that all three faiths were able to live side by side and at least tolerate each other. That plan still seemed to be holding, however, thank God. John Paul also had to make up his mind as to whom to make the next Cohen Gadol. He had tried to convince Samuel that having a Christian leader ministering in a revered mosque made no sense, but Samuel had been adamant. Oh well, he thought, we all have our crosses to bear. He was currently leaning towards Ibrahim, the late Suleiman's deputy in Jerusalem. He was a Muslim who was quite familiar with the area and was quite accepting of other people's faiths. Then, of course, there was the latest issue. One of his priests, a man who wasn't a Samuelist, had sent him a note asking him to rule on the theological implications of the existence of ghosts. How did the realms Samuel knew as Sheol relate to hell, heaven, and purgatory? In order to answer this question, he'd need to talk to Samuel and learn more about this mysterious location. He knocked on the door of the building assigned to Samuel's interpreter. The man told him to come in and take his shoes off. The pontiff did so, explaining what exactly he wanted from Samuel. The interpreter's eyes were a bit wide and was about to speak when the prophet suddenly appeared in the tent. John Paul flinched a little. He would never get accustomed to that. Samuel nodded to John Paul. "You wish to see me, John Paul?" "Yes, Holy One. I need to advise the Christian sect on how Sheol maps to the domains of heaven, hell, and purgatory. You're familiar with those terms, right?" "Yes, I'm not sure how accurate they are, but I can see how someone could have thought that." "I agree. First, tell me more about Sheol, and I apologize if I've asked this before. Do people of all faiths all go to Sheol?" "Yes, I've run into a few Moabite prophets down there." "Interesting. Are there criteria which a person has to follow in order to make it to Sheol?" "No, everyone goes there after death. So you don't have to be religious at all. You can be a sinner in your own personal faith and still make it there." "Can anyone return from Sheol?" "Only wizards can, and even so with difficulty. When they do so, they come back as ghosts." John Paul jotted down notes on a piece of paper as he continued. "Now the hard questions. Are there angels in Sheol?" Samuel thought for a moment. Then he frowned. "Yes and no. There aren't any creatures with wings which look like your sect's angels. However, you have to realize that everyone visiting from Sheol takes the form of a glowing, floating spirit like the way you see me. They're just naked souls without bodies. It is quite possible that someone found out about the description of a ghost, was partially obliviated, and came up with the idea of an angel." "What about the theory that you meet God in Sheol?" Samuel shook his head. "Faith in the existence of a personal God is orthogonal to Sheol. Ghosts keep whatever religious views they had in life, which means that there are lots of theists in Sheol. Many people thank their deities for being granted an afterlife at all." "How many of these theists meet God in there?" "It depends on what concept of God you're thinking about. If you expect someone to solve all of your problems, you're not going to find him. However, I have reason to believe that the sight of spirits floating through the air could easily cause people to believe that they've found God as well as angels." "Are there atheists in Sheol?" "Do you meet your loved ones in Sheol when you pass over?" "Yes and no. In theory, given enough time, you can find anyone. However, Sheol is a very big place as far as we can tell, boundless. The odds that you will actually find where one of your colleagues has been flying around are relatively remote." "Do you find existence in Sheol to be better, worse, or the same as real life?" Samuel thought for a moment. "You can't compare them, really. You don't have any responsibilities anymore, so that's a bit of an advantage. However, Sheol itself is pretty dull, especially for beings who can't come back. All in all, I'd say it's about even. Some people may find it better than life, in which case they'll call it heaven. Others may find it unbearable, in which case they call it hell. It's all in the spirit's point of view." "Can people die again, so to speak, and be removed from Sheol?" "Unclear, John Paul. People disappear from time to time, but it's possible that they have either left the immediate area or have returned to the world as ghosts." "How about non-humans? Do non-humans appear in Sheol?" "Yes, all sentient beings of all species appear in Sheol, and that's from a lot of experience." "What species have you seen?" "Various forms of humanoids, of course. I occasionally see dolphins or extremely hairy humanoids. You call them gorillas and chimpanzees." "Is there a common language? Everyone can speak down there." "No, there are still language barriers. However, it's possible to learn new languages given centuries of practice." John Paul drew a deep breath. Have you seen the Savior in Sheol? The prophet Joshua of Nazareth, you mean? He shrugged. I don't know what he looks like. However, given that he was martyred 2,000 years ago, I'm assuming he's dead. If so, yes, he is in Sheol, where I don't know. The talk continued, and a picture slowly began to emerge. Sheol seemed much more like the Greek version of Hades, an alternate world where everyone went. Perhaps the story of St. Peter at the pearly gates was allegorical, talking about a believer's own personal view of heaven, or possibly influenced by the stories where Odysseus meets Tiresias and the gatekeeper in Hades. The pontiff could understand how this domain have easily been seen to be filled with angels, God, and so forth, and whether or not people found Sheol as heaven or hell depended on their view of the world. In fact, it would make sense that wealthy people would find Sheol as hell and the religious ascetics would see it as heaven. Wealthy people would be stripped of all of their physical pleasures in Sheol, so they wouldn't like it. Ascetics would be more spiritual and knowledgeable and wouldn't be tied to material goods, so they'd handle the transition better. There was a lot of stuff to think about here. Chapter 452, Aborted Cruise. Tuesday, December 3, 1996, Silver Explorer Antarctic Cruise, ship near Tselnitz Atlantis, DEFCON status. 346% Michael Barham had been looking forward to this Antarctic trip for a while. He'd been captivated by pictures of glaciers, penguins, and crystal-clear water. Some of his friends had joked that he'd run into icebergs, but he countered by saying that this ship's name wasn't Titanic. He had balked a bit at the price, a good $8,000. He hadn't realized how hard it was to get from Ushuaia in Chile across the Southern Ocean. Although the two continents looked close on a map, in real life it was much further than it seemed. There would be several days of cruising simply to get to the Antarctic Peninsula, and those days had increased the price of the ticket greatly. He'd bitten the bullet, however, and booked a room. It had been worth it, however, especially when word leaked out that the ship would be one of the first to be visiting the new Tsalal community of Tselna, sitting on the Antarctic Peninsula. Bahram had never met a wizard before, and he wanted to learn more. Unfortunately, the cruise line didn't really have much information on Tselna and the Tsalal community in general. Supposedly, Tselna had a few thousand people and was rapidly becoming a base from which to explore the Antarctic Peninsula. A few of the Tsalal actually spoke English, which would help as well. There hadn't been much trade yet between the Tsalal and Muggle communities. So far, the wizards had been trying to pick up computers and other pieces of Muggle technology. The Muggles, in return, were getting lots of equipment magically hardened against the cold. The fact that people had been living down there under the ice cap for all those years had been absolutely mind-blowing. He watched from the railing, wearing a parka, of course, as the ship closed in on the new Tsalal city. There were a few fanciful buildings there, but all in all it looked just like a typical small village anywhere in the world. A few people were flying by on brooms, but from what the brochure had told him, their brooms weren't popular down here because the wind chill from the flight would make a bad situation a lot worse. Apparition, magical teleportation, was much more popular. There wasn't a pier for the ship to pull up to. The locals hadn't gotten to that point yet. Consequently, the passengers would have to disembark in groups of 5 or so and go ashore in the Zodiacs. Several popping sounds resonated throughout the ship as the wizards beamed aboard to process customs and so forth. Everyone lined up near the Zodiac Bay to get off the ship. Bahram saw several people in white robes scouring the ship. What were they checking for? Illegal drugs. The brochure hadn't mentioned anything about a full inspection of cruise ships. He debated asking one of the wizards what was going on, but they seemed very intent on what they were doing. So he decided to not get between them and their prey. The people stood in line for a long time, a very long time. Clearly, something unusual was going on. What was it? Were they checking for biological contamination? If so, they weren't doing a good job of it because the first person in line hadn't been processed yet. He glanced at the bridge, wondering if they were doing something up there. Finally, the boat's messaging system squawked as the bridge deigned to explain what was going on. Ladies and gentlemen, your attention please. This is the captain speaking. I have just spoken with Captain Sino of the Tsalal Coast Guard. Due to circumstances beyond our control, Salasia has closed all of its borders to American citizens. No one with an American passport will be able to set foot in the city. In lieu of a trip to Tselna, American citizens will be given a trip in the Zodiac to the island across the straits from Tselna. Bahram stared at his passport and muttered, "What the hell?" He wasn't the only one. The bridge continued. I can't get into details, unfortunately. Suffice it to say that a recent incident has made the Tsalal government a bit leery of Americans. I don't know what we could have done to get these guys angry at us, but what's done is done. In all fairness, Sino reports that the citizens of Tselna are as shocked and taken by surprise as we are. Bahram scratched his head. Had the Americans planned to occupy Salasia, that made no sense as they couldn't live there without extensive resupplying. Then what had gotten everyone riled up? The only country the Americans had a beef with in the magical world, at least as far as he knew, was Círdan. And to be fair, the Círdani deserved it for what they did to their Muggles. Did the Tsalal also enslave their Muggles? No, he realized. If the Tsalal enslaved their Muggles, they wouldn't want the non-American passengers to see it, either. So they wouldn't have let potential witnesses off the ship. And he doubted that they'd singled out American Muggles, because they were better at fighting wizards than those of other countries. The United States must have done something to antagonize Salasia, he realized. But what? Were Círdan and Salasia allies, and Salasia threatening to go to war with the United States if Clinton took action against the Círdani slave drivers? That's just what we need, Bahram thought bitterly. Another war with wizards. A second, heavily accented male voice boomed over the intercom. This is Captain Sino. On behalf of the community of Tselna, I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. The people of Tselna are actually clamoring for the government in Salax to revoke the ban on Americans in Salasia's main trading post. Hopefully, Salax and Washington will be able to resolve this issue quickly and peacefully, so people will be able to visit Tselna without any fear of repercussion. Shit, Bahram thought. Sino had said peacefully. The odds of the us getting into a war with Salasia seemed to be increasing by the moment. The Tsalal continued. As a gesture of goodwill and respect for the Muggle world, several of the stores in Selna have donated items to be given to the American tourists. There are 15 items available, and they will be given out at random. I don't know about where you guys come from, but here in Salasia, foreign civilians are off limits to government military decrees and activity. By the time you return to your cabins after this speech, the winners will have the prizes sitting in their rooms. All I can recommend is pray to whatever god or gods you believe in that this crisis will end without serious consequences. There was a brief pause, after which Tsino concluded his statement. I'll now turn this message back over to the captain of this vessel. Once again, welcome to Tsalasia, and I hope that next time I speak with you, everyone will be able to visit our fine land. Swearing bitterly to himself, he made his way out of the line and back to his room. He swore once again when he saw that someone had placed a stuffed penguin in his bed. Bahram grunted just what he needed, a practical joke. Furious, he picked up the penguin and prepared to throw it into the closet. That's when the penguin spoke up in the same dialect Sino had used. Hello there, I'm Sally, and I come from Tsuknu's toy store in downtown Selna. What's your name? Bahram dropped the penguin in surprise, then watched in amazement as it made its way over to the couch, waddling like a real penguin. All right, I get the point. You want me to sleep on the couch. I still think there's room for both of us, though. Hey, I'm nice and cuddly. Kids love me. And if you don't have kids, Well, I bet girls will all fall over you when you carry a cute gal like me around. Hey, if you want, I can even lay an egg. It won't be a real egg, though. Bahram's mind raced. He couldn't really use the silly thing, especially if it spent the entire trip chattering like this. However, this would likely be a valuable souvenir in Kentucky. That would especially be the case if the embargo against the United States continued for a while. Maybe he could auction it off somewhere. For some reason, a practical joke on his Linux engineering friend came to mind. Beelzebub Castle, 10 miles from Frankfurt, Germany. Fire under the glass cauldron in the dungeon was already burning. An old man in a dark blue tiara walked closer to it. He looked at the piece of paper in his hand. Yes, this spell will definitely please Mr. Maggot. That piece of paper was actually the right part of the demonic scroll, a powerful and ancient artifact used to create the Wunschpunch potion. It was a very dark and forbidden type of magic, something the man liked very much. His name was Beelzebub Preposterer, and he was a dark sorcerer. Not a very skilled one, but a sorcerer nonetheless. However, unlike regular wizards, he wasn't born with his abilities. He acquired them from someone through a very painful and disgusting ritual. Maledictus Maggot was the name of that being. He was a humanoid bug-like creature, dressed in very expensive Muggle business suit. He was supposedly working for an organization called Hellish Wishes, Inc. Beelzebub met Mr. Maggot a long time ago and made a deal with him. In exchange for his soul, Beelzebub would get magical powers and the ability to see magical creatures. There was a catch, of course. The newly made sorcerer was forced to use his spells only for evil or personal gain, never for good. Preposterer didn't care about that, as he wasn't all that good to begin with. He later learned that his Aunt Tyrannia Vampirella had the left part of the demonic scroll and that she also made a deal with Maledictus. He remembered laughing when he discovered that. Well, this explains the longevity of that old hag. But now he wasn't laughing. He was scared. 2 days ago, Mr. Maggot visited Beelzebub and told him that since the statue of secrecy is over, he has spread his work to Muggles and increased the number and size of his evil spells to city levels. The old man then asked what will be the consequences if he doesn't deliver. Maledictus simply smiled and said, "Oh, nothing big. I'll just eat your soul if you don't create a spell evil and powerful enough to destroy an entire city. You have 5 days." He then teleported away in a flash of yellow smoke. Immediately after that, Beelzebub contacted his accursed aunt. Both of them hated each other, but maybe, just maybe, she would be able to help him. When she arrived, Preposterer noticed that she hasn't slept well in a few days. He then understood that Mr. Maggot visited her as well. Now they were standing on the opposite sides of the glass cauldron in Beelzebub's dungeon. A green liquid was boiling in it. It smelled horribly. "All right, do you have the right part?" asked Tyrannia. He nodded and waved the piece of paper before her face. "I do, but do you have the left part?" she replied with the same thing. "Good, now let's begin. We don't have much time." Vampirella looked at him with hateful eyes. She despised him, and yet they were forced to work together. "Time for a little mega magic," they both screamed as hard as they could, and the pieces of the demonic scroll started glowing a little with green light. They then took turns telling the incantation. Tyrannia began, and a part of the scroll flew up in the air. "By the power, hail and hearty." Beelzebub continued, and the right part started flying as well. "Of an earthquake on a roll." "To be party, part and party." Both parts slammed into each other and started merging. "Of the one and only scroll." The scroll was complete, and powerful light was emanating from it. Then both of them started screaming the rest of the spell. "Formula of the deepest night, if it's you, then show your might. Join what once was with asunder to the sound of flames and thunder. Ready, set, Wunschpunch." The liquid exploded with green lightning bolts, smoke, and the sound of 1,000 tortured souls. Seconds later, all of that was sucked left back into the cauldron. However, the spell wasn't complete yet. Now they had to state their wish. Beelzebub screamed, "O potent bowl of our incredible potion, hear our wish and grant us a devotion. Remove all colors and all their hues, from green to reds and yellows and blues. O great spell, remove all colors from sight, and turn everything black and white." Tyrannia yelled, "Now we'll say it in reverse to make our curse a whole lot worse. White and black everything turn, and sight from colors all remove, spell great O. Blues and yellows and reds to green from, hues they're all, and colors all remove." A giant black and white lightning bolt flew out of the cauldron, and after minutes of flying, touched the city of Frankfurt. Moments later, everything in the city lost its colors. People, animals, buildings, everything. Mass panic ensued while Beelzebub and Tyrannia laughed. Chapter 453, New York Portkeys. Tuesday, December 3, 1996, Metropolitan Transportation Authority, New York, United States of America. Atlantis, DEFCON status. 346% next up. You've got Audrey, but we've got Audrey Roman too. Kathy C. had suddenly become a very busy witch. Originally the deputy chairman of the American Portkey Bureau, she had been catapulted into the corner office when her predecessor had found himself in Greenwich during the attack on the four towns. It had taken her a while to get up to speed on the job, one which was getting more and more complicated and exciting every moment. First, there had been the requests to put up the Portkey barrier shortly before Judgment Day, something her predecessor hadn't done in 5 years. Businessmen complained, of course, that none of their shipments were going through, but she had convinced them that safety was paramount, particularly after the bombs went off. Then there had been the requests by Linda Warren to send Portkeys into space. The Russians had initially complained when that sneaker had materialized aboard Mir. Then there was the acquisition of the Apollo 11 command module and its rechristening as Selene. The people who had been maintaining the capsule had gone bonkers, and she'd had to done some fancy talking to placate them. As if that hadn't been enough, she was being bombarded with requests to send people into the outer solar system, a bad idea, as the best speed Portkeys seemed to be capable of was about 10 every 10 days. Granted, travel with a Portkey was much faster than travel with normal rockets. However, a one-way trip to Pluto was still going to take a year at least. Didn't people realize how big the solar system was? And interstellar exploration? Forget it. It would take millennia unless wizards developed FTL travel, and she knew that was impossible. Her most recent project, one which had been a major boon for commuters, had managed to raise the ire of everyone from McDonnell Douglas to Guinevere's flying carpets. This, of course, had been the Boston Portkey Authority. Now, in its third week, this pilot program had revolutionized travel in the Boston area. It had been expanded to include the MBTA commuter rail system as well, which had managed to include a route to Providence and irritate Amtrak. There were lawsuits all over the place saying it was too dangerous, and she had countered with an emphasis that this was a pilot program and people were using it at their own risk. The success of the Boston Portkey Authority had not gone unnoticed in the other New England towns. Providence had set up its own Portkey Authority in lieu of a modern subway. Springfield, Worcester, Hartford, and Nashua had followed suit. All of these Portkeys charged MBTA-level fares to start with, though many customers suspected that they were going to raise prices once these organizations realized that they had no competition. Setting up the Portkey Authority for these towns was going to be far easier than the Community C was currently talking with, New York. New York had more people than the other cities put together, doubled at least. As a result, there were many more locations which needed Portkeys associated with them. The Long Island Railroad would have to be included in this as well, which meant that even more Portkeys would be necessary. Finally, there were cases where a Portkey couldn't travel from point A to point B because there was a large area full of radioactive contamination between them. People would have to go around those areas lest they start growing a third ear. On the other hand, it was fairly obvious that something had to be done to improve the transportation system in New York. A good portion of the subway service had been disrupted when the bomb had gone off on Judgment Day. Many of the MTA tunnels had flooded, and a large number of cars had been destroyed. Traffic had been an absolute disaster since that day, with everyone relying either on walking or on taxicabs. There had been too many taxis in New York even before the bomb had gone off. Now, however, things were insane. People joked that one could walk on top of the taxicabs and get to his destination faster than they would have in the cars. Guinevere's flying carpets and man had gotten several customers here. However, a lot of people were still nervous about flying on rugs with big pictures of Winnie the Pooh on them. There had even been a few arrests where commuters going by on flying carpets had managed to stop en route, look into the apartments on the 34th floor, and see people undressing. Clearly, something else needed to be done. C explained her plan to the MTA authorities. Here's what we're going to do. We'll have a network of 512 stations, each with up to 16 bidirectional portkeys. I take it you have enough junk to supply 8,000 portkeys. The MTA chairman chuckled. This is New York, Sorceress Sea. There's trash all over the place unless Astronaut Lady does something about that and portkeys it into space. C blinked. She hadn't thought about that. You know, that might not be a bad idea. I'll get back to you on that. At any rate, here's the plan. The transit map will be divided into 8 sectors, one on Long Island, one for the suburbs north of the Bronx, one on the Jersey side, and one for each borough. Each of these sectors will consist of 8 subsectors consisting of 8 destinations each. Got it so far? Yep, 8 cubed is 512. Good. The passenger goes to one of these 512 stations and will see a group of 9 portkeys. 7 of them go to the other locations in that station's subsector, and they will be used for local travel. One of them will go to a station which represents the subsector as a whole and is intended to be used as a launch pad for longer journeys. These subsector-level stations will have 16 portkeys, 8 to the destinations in the subsector, 7 to the subsector-level stations of the other 7 subsectors, and 1 to the station representing the sector as a whole. This last portkey will take the customer to a sector-level station, which will have 15 portkeys, 1 to each of the 8 subsector-level stations, and 1 to each of the 7 other sector-level stations, representing the other 7 sectors. The net result will be a 3-level tree, which will get from anywhere to anywhere else in 5 jumps. The MTA man nodded. I see. Station A1A to subsector A1 to sector A to sector B to subsector B3 to station B3H. Sounds intriguing. It should be, sir. It's the future of transportation in the area, especially with the subway overwhelmed as it is. I'd recommend a rack of maybe 5 or 10 pieces of junk per leg to make sure there isn't a wait. We're up to 80,000 portkeys now, but like you said, this is New York. The MTA man, however, still had a few questions. Will these people actually be flying through the air? Will people on the ground see them? Not easily, but it's possible. Why do you ask? Won't people driving around be a bit distracted if people are zooming over their heads at a high rate of speed? C had anticipated that. At first, perhaps. However, if they've got their eyes on the road, they won't see the portkey passengers. Besides, after a while they'll get accustomed to it. I see. What about buildings? Will people on these things crash into buildings? No, portkeys automatically maneuver their way around buildings. The passengers will approach the building and go around it. Another MTA representative spoke up. Won't these flying people be able to look into apartments as well like the ones on the flying carpets? Not really. They'll be going too fast to see much. What about airplanes? I see LGA and JFK are both on the list as possible destinations. Do you really want people flying around only to be run over by 747s on final approach? C pointed out one of the features on the proposed Portkey map. Nope. The subsectors with the two airports are such so that the other 7 substations do not cross the airspace near the airport. If the airport Portkey comes in on the west side, all other 7 stations in that subsector will be to the airport's west. No one will be flying over the airport. That brings up another thing. There may be cases where subsector to subsector and sector to sector travel may require more than one jump. In cases where direct access won't work, such as line-of-sight routes which would cross air lanes or Wall Bay, passengers will have to get off at an intermediary stop and pick up another portkey to complete their journey. How long will it take to make a trip like this? I normally assume 60 seconds per leg maximum, most of which is going to be pulling yourself off the pile of cushions and trying to find the piece of junk representing the next leg. This would mean at most a 6-8-minute trip anywhere in the city. Local trips will be 30-60 seconds. A third MTA person raised her hand. Will disabled people be able to travel this way? There's going to be a lot of walking involved along with falling into piles of cushions. C shook her head. I'm afraid not. The best way to transport someone with disabilities would be to use a flying carpet. Guinevere rents them out for about $40 a month for simple one-man carpets. What happens if 3 people arrive at the same station at the same time? Will they fall on top of each other? People tend to be much harder than pillows in my experience. I hate to think what would happen half an hour before a Rangers game is about to start. C hesitated for a moment. She was a bit worried about this herself. There had been a couple of incidents where people had injured themselves in Boston in this fashion, and that had been with many fewer stations and many, many fewer people. She drew a deep breath. We're trying to figure out how to handle that, and a committee is looking into it. They've promised to have a solution by the end of the year. Once that's taken care of, we'll start installing the portkeys in early February or March, provided that. One of the MTA people looked mopey. Can't you do it any faster? You were able to set something up for Boston pretty quickly. Yes, but that was for a much smaller scale operation, which was piggybacked on the existing MBTA system. Here, we're effectively replacing a lot of the subway system here and ramping it up to cover not only a city over 10 times the size of Boston, but 2 airports and Long Island as well. Trust me when I tell you that this is much more complicated. However, rest assured that once it's done, you'll have the most advanced transportation system in the world, at least for now. Another MTA employee cut in. Sounds cool. Here's another idea. How hard would it be to take all of these cities with portkey authorities and connect them with portkeys? With one additional level of complexity, you can get from Boston to New York in 60 seconds. C smiled. We're actually thinking about that. However, we want to get this off the ground first. One thing I can tell you is that it's going to take more than 60 seconds to get from Boston to New York. We're talking maybe 20 minutes or so. As it is, getting from Boston to Providence takes 5 minutes. That's twice as fast as an airplane, and you don't have to go through security and get there early. Correct. The trick here is what we're going to charge for such a service. Realistically, portkeys require minimal maintenance, maybe a few $1,000s a year to replace a broken or missing portkey. What's more, the maintenance costs don't depend on the distance traveled. In theory, we can just charge maybe $5 each way to go from Boston to New York in 20 minutes and still make money. The MTA board began talking excitedly among themselves. Finally, the chairman pulled rank. Yeah, and it's going to put companies like American Eagle, Greyhound, and Amtrak out of business. In this economy, that's no a good idea. C nodded. There is that, of course, plus the fact that it's difficult for disabled people to travel by portkey. In addition, can you imagine grasping a portkey without letting go for 20 minutes? That's one of the reasons we're not sure what to do about long-distance service at this point. However, rest assured that it's on the drawing board, provided that all of these pilot programs work out all right. Sargasasa than Searden. Few things are worse in war than getting trapped behind enemy lines. Unfortunately, when a group was composed of individuals from both warring entities, it was pretty much the default state of existence. That was why Salmon Nas Thuros, one of the top 100 wealthiest being in the hidden nations, which says a lot, considering how overrepresented royals and other noble families with a tendency of hoarding treasures over centuries were in those countries, was currently cowering in the burnt-out ruins of a cottage, wondering how it all went wrong. It all started nicely, arriving to Círdan with his girlfriend and house elf. Sure, Myrtil got a few stares, but as she was a known Vila, B, way too young to have been a combatant in the last war, and C, well known for being his girlfriend, none of the customary accusations of being a spy seducer or any desire for revenge were voiced by the wizards and witches they met. Their aura escorts, assigned for their own protection, were outright amiable, a stark contrast with how he and his family were forced to leave the country last time. Well, that time was about 2 decades ago, and boy, did Círdan change. The end of the Statute of Secrecy brought along great changes. It started subtly, but with the Muggles getting involved, the traditional structure of Círdan society soon began to crumble. Spellcasters were no longer the unquestionable authority they used to be, and as the Yahoos were granted more and more rights, they became increasingly divided. Some of both groups even reached the point when they resorted to open violence. It got to the point, month ago, where wizards now noticeably avoided stepping close to Yahoo's fear from unexpected knifings became second nature to them. Rumors said that the Americans even supplied the Yahoos with gunpowder weapons, probably smuggling it along the shipments of mechanized farming and industrial equipment. Well, at least those were conveniently converted to work on magic, preserving the local environment, and by now enough wizards got a hang of mechanics, and enough muggles learned rudimentary magic theory to ensure the machines were maintained well. More, they recently succeeded in building machinery on their own, combining magic and mechanics quite adeptly well, not on rock-to-rattle Dryder-Walker levels, but they were getting close. On the other hand, the sight of imported and custom-made machinery, along with pack mules, inevitably reminded Salmoner of a certain desert planet's mismatched technology seen in a very popular Muggle movie. However, it was all blown to hell when Nestor invaded. They were in the northern part of the country, tracking down one of the family grimoires volumes when they learned of it, in the form of a Vila air raid. Apparently, a sizable army of the Feathered Ones attempted to take out an installation in a local fishing village, recently given to some refugees. The invaders were met with fierce resistance and rooted in a destructive dogfight by wizards on brooms, but not before unleashing a veritable rain of fire. As their shelter caved in on them, Floppy the house elf used her magic to fling them away into relative safety, but she was trapped under falling debris. He managed to excavate her in time, but they also had to deal with their escorts, as those turned on Myrtil. Disabling 3 auras was really taking a lot of luck, including some late fireballs, but in the end they got out in walking condition, only to learn that the elf had an internal skull fracture, a condition usually lethal in a few days. Fortunately, he found a reference to a possible cure in one of the recovered grimoires. Unfortunately, the volume referenced was in the south, what now became a war zone. To complicate things, Portkey barriers and anti-apparition jinxes were powered up all through the nation, restricting teleportation to manned checkpoints. If their escorts were any indication, they wanted to avoid those. The elf was conscious but unwell, and required all her will to stay awake, so that approach was out of the question. In the end, they sneaked into the burning village and borrowed the first boat they could in the chaos, hastily enchanted it, and took off, barely above tree level. They did reach the south, but now they had another problem. The desired location was in Vila-infested territory, and seeing how her fellow Nestorians had let his girlfriend walk into a soon-to-be war zone with no warning, Salmoner had problems trusting them any more than his own countrymen. Círdan. Racer was in the throne room again, reporting to the cancellors about how they stopped the Vila incursion in the north at least, when the messenger arrived, handing a report to Vixar, who read it and tore it in anger. Well, Merwizard, it seems your kind is more persistent than we were led to believe. Do you know of any reason why there are Merwizards and Rock-to-Rattle military walkers appearing at our coasts, other than that they are pissed over our blockade? The renegade shook his head. No, but they are bluffing. The blockade itself is left alone, and they didn't assist the Vila raid on our base. They are scared of the political implications. Vixar frowned. Explain. Say, what happens if the eldest and the Archons send their armies of walkers and battle mages against us, numbering in the tens of thousands? Only a fool would meet them in open battle. They'd wipe us out in sieges too, snapped Ortilu. Probably, if we are on our own. But we have Tsalasia, and why is that? America, replied Sayatnan. As long as they are siding with Nestor, anyone siding with Nestor would be branded as traitors to all the wizarding world, assisting Muggles in a war of conquest against wizard kind. It would escalate to the point where the Gulliver consortium might get involved, quickly leading to a world war while Atlantis is still recovering from the last Judgment Day. Reassuring, said Vixar, but I'd like some contingency plans for a case when Nestor sees the Americans are more trouble than they are worth, and they choose to just sick the merpeople on us. He'd been thinking about it for some time, mused Racer. Here is what we will do. Greater Council, Chamber Octa-Rattle. Avernus's ears were still ringing after yet another howler from Mercalli. This time, the insufferable hag was complaining that her strike force was decimated. I don't understand her, he complained to the eldest. I did warn her that these are trained battle mage and powerful dark wizards. What did they expect? A sensual back massage. Despite the severity of the situation, the old Rock-to-Rattly chuckled. She might just be scared that her girls and lads didn't manage to charm the enemy into harmlessness. Speaking of Wick, how is it even possible? The Archon sighed. 2 reasons. 1, our fighters are taught to take out hostile Vila from outside of charm range. 2, these are dark wizards. Some of the evil rituals they perform on themselves leaves them with decreased fertility and diminished sexual drive. Less for the Vila to work with, guessed the eldest. The Trapanandan ruler nodded and asked, So, what's next? Our soldiers did scare the Ciudadani, but not enough to withdraw the blockade. They effectively called our bluff, so they don't believe we would truly invade. What might go in their heads, I wonder. Simple. They know our power. They know that if we send our armies of walkers and battle mages against them, numbering in the tens of thousands, they have no chance to win. Only a fool would meet them in open battle. It would be 4 nations against 1. But then there is Tsalasia. We would forfeit their friendship if we were to side with the Muggles in the invasion of a wizard nation. So, as long as America is involved. We wait, they said in unison. Chapter 454, Exotic Plants for Sale. Wednesday, December 4, 1996, Chiang's exotic herbskynat on San Francisco, United States of America Atlantis, DEFCON status. 346% next up. The man who could have saved millions Gu, Chiang signed for the FedEx delivery as the courier shook his head in disbelief. I must say, sir, I've never heard of any of these things before, and I've delivered a lot of strange things to shops like this in Chinatown. Chiang looked at the set of boxes and bowed. It's understandable, sir, to be honest. I'm not entirely sure what I'm getting either. All I can tell you is that it will be unique. The FedEx man frowned. Where did you import this stuff from? Those symbols on the package sure don't look like Chinese to me. They're foreign, obviously. Come to think of it, why isn't there a customs slip associated with the delivery? Chiang laughed. They're from an internal supplier. We don't need to worry about customs declarations, at least for now. For all I know, though, the Food and Drug Administration may start cracking down on us more. What do these plants do? And how can you have no idea what you're getting? Certainly you placed the order, as I see it's supposed to be delivered to you. Chiang finished signing the forms and handed them back to the deliveryman. I placed the order all right. I told them to give me stuff that was unique. I need to sell something that neither the Whole Foods down the street nor the other Chinese stores sells. Otherwise, I'll go out of business. The FedEx man sounded dubious. All right, I'll play along. Where did you get this from? Something really doesn't sound right here. I want to know the truth, sir. What's going on here? Chiang groaned. I got it from the MT St. Helens facility. It's wizarding stuff. You've got to admit, no one else will have it. The FedEx man looked at the boxes and shuddered. Gremlins. Chiang blinked. Excuse me. The movie. Remember at the beginning when the guy gets that cute little animal from the store? Everything is wonderful until it gets wet, reproduces, and the little children start feeding after midnight. Next we know, there are monsters running all over the place, and there goes the neighborhood. Jiang laughed as the FedEx man turned to leave. These are plants, for God's sake. They just sit there. They're not going to walk around and try to strangle people. The FedEx man threw one last comment over his shoulder. How do you know, sir? Maybe magical plants walk. Jiang frowned as the man drove away. He hadn't thought of that. Would these plants actually try to convince their owners to water them? Come to think of it, wasn't there a movie when a plant needed to be fed blood to survive? He looked at some of the boxes with trepidation. MT. Sent. Helens wouldn't have sent him dangerous plants now, would they? Watering Ken at the ready. Did these even take water? He opened the first box and found a large, well-sealed container holding an odd green, slimy substance. This plant looked like it was some kind of cross between green moss and a worm of some sort. He breathed a sigh of relief when he realized that, at least for the time being, this plant wasn't moving around. A long piece of parchment had been packed with the specimen. Hoping that these were instructions as to what the plant did and how to care for it, he unrolled it and began to read. Gillyweed inspiratus submarinus. Gillyweed is a magical plant found in carefully protected areas in the Mediterranean and Black Seas. It has a tubular form and is often compared to green rat tails. It features kelp-like leaves approximately 16 centimeters in diameter and prefers relatively sandy soil. Although the leaves themselves are edible and somewhat tasty, the tubular roots are what makes gillyweed a well-known and revered magical herb. Gillyweed is best known for giving people the ability to breathe underwater for a limited time. One 4-ounce serving of gillyweed allows for 60 minutes of underwater operation in a typical lake or ocean environment. Up to 3 ounces of gillyweed can be consumed at any one time. Eating more than 16 servings of gillyweed in a span of 24 hours or less can result in breathing difficulties and possible pulmonary damage. Gillyweed is a powerful herb. However, this power can be dangerous if misused. It does its job by closing off the eater's lungs about 10 seconds after ingestion and opening 2 sets of gills on each side of the body. Once the gills fully develop, 5 more seconds, the eater will be able to breathe underwater like a merperson or fish. The consumer's hands and feet will experience temporary webbing while the gillyweed is in effect. This will allow him or her to swim more easily. Chiang looked at the herb thoughtfully, something which allows the user to breathe underwater without scuba equipment. This sounds like it would be a real boon for places in the Caribbean which feature coral reefs. All the person has to do is eat some of this stuff and leave the scuba tanks at home. The only problem he could think of would be that this ability sounded awfully dangerous. If anything went wrong, the person could easily drown. On the other hand, if there was something else in these boxes which helped mitigate the risk. He turned back to the information pamphlet. At the end of the allotted period, the eater's gills will close up and the lungs will reinflate. It is imperative that the eater be near the surface at the time this occurs. Otherwise, he or she could drown. Green Thumb Growers recommends that the wizard cast Ascendio as soon as he feels the gills begin to close. There will be a brief tingle in the gills, about 5 seconds before they do so. which should be enough time for the eater to bring out a Wandaro, thought Chiang. Don't tell me this stuff is only safe to use if the consumer can cast spells. Maybe this hadn't been a good idea after all. Warnings 1. Gillyweed will not work in water with high salinity. 2. Like any set of gills, the organs produced by gillyweed will simply siphon oxygen from the water. If gillyweed is used to explore a region with a low oxygen content, the user can still asphyxiate. 3. Gillyweed does nothing to handle pressure-related issues such as the bends and eardrum pain. As a result, green thumb growers recommend that people dive no deeper than 15 meters. 4. Do not dive in water colder than 15 Celsius. 5. Gillyweed does not protect against grindelows, which can be common in kelp forests and ponds. Wonderful, Chiang thought. You can get a disease as well, or was that some kind of poisonous fish which the Muggles were blissfully ignorant of? He was starting to have several doubts about this now. There were a few more warnings, most of which made sense. Don't dive alone, for instance. The last warning was followed by care instructions, which he discovered he would be able to follow by simply placing the sample in the koi pond in the back of the store and making sure the fish didn't get at it. Although he figured he wouldn't be stupid enough to try to sell that stuff himself, he could always serve as a supplier to the Caribbean. Putting away the gillyweed, he turned to the next box. This one contained a small bush with the root system still intact. It was clear it was supposed to be planted outside somewhere. It, too, had instructions associated with it. Dittany magus magus dictamnus. Dittany magus is magical herb which grows in small bushes about 20 to 30 centimeters across. It grows best in areas which do not exceed 30 Celsius for long periods of time. Don't try growing it near the poles, however, as frost will kill it. Keep it in direct sunlight as much as possible. Dittany magus is best known for its use in essence of dittany, a powerful healing salve. When placed on wounds, essence of dittany will cause the wound to heal within minutes, leaving barely a scar. Chiang blinked. Now this was something he could sell, particularly to people who didn't balk at trying unusual medicinal herbs. Although this herb is well regarded for its magical potency and has been used by wizards for hundreds of years in the Aegean, one must keep in mind that it will only heal the wound. If the wound triggers an infection before it can be healed, the patient will still have to treat the infection. It should go without saying that it cannot heal fatal wounds or chronic medical conditions. To prepare essence of dittany, wait until the spring and pick the blue berries which develop on the leaves. Crush the berries, squeeze the sap into a pot, and add the leaves. Pour the contents into a pot and bring it to a boil. Add some cinnamon into the boiling pot and stir 3 times clockwise and 5 times counterclockwise. Once you've done that, wait for it to cool. The resulting potion can begin healing wounds as soon as it comes to room temperature. It will remain potent for 5 years, after which it should be discarded and rebrewed. Chiang gave a whoop of joy and began looking around for his cinnamon sticks. There they were, sitting in a corner. He was all set to go, except for one small problem. The specimen in the box didn't have any berries on it. Chiang scratched his head and read on, finding that Dittany magus produced berries in April. Wonderful, he thought. He needed to keep this plant alive long enough to get it to produce the berries. He couldn't put it outside because he didn't want animals or other Chinese apothecaries to get their hands on it. Something told him that he was going to have to keep this plant in his own house. He made a mental note to throw out the cat if it ate too much of the stuff. Chapter 455, World War Grindelwald. Wednesday, December 4, 1996, United Nations, Building Geneva, Switzerland, Atlantis, DEFCON status. 345%. Next up. See it fly. Anastasios Dialonis looked at the American representative in horror. So it is true then, sir. The Americans have sued Atlantis for not preventing the genocide of the Jews in the Second World War. The American nodded. Not only that, but it's become a class-action lawsuit. Thousands of people whose families have been victims of genocide have joined it. There are Armenians involved, for instance, as well as members of the other ethnic groups Germany targeted during the war. What's more, from what I've been told, Urban Roman 9 himself has joined the suit. Dionysus looked at him warily. The head of Christians for humans, what does he have to do with this? He's a gypsy, remember, and he supposedly lost an uncle in the war. Besides, we know him well enough to figure he would jump at anything to make life hard for the wizards. I see. The story is a bit complicated. However, to begin with, you have to understand that the statute of secrecy made it quite difficult for us to intervene. The American looked down at his notes. I agree. However, it was not impossible. You have Oblivators, after all. All you had to do is do something magical to rescue the people in the concentration camps and cover them up. Am I correct? Dionysus fidgeted a little. Technically, yes. However, there are two major obstacles to that. First, an operation like this would require thousands of Oblivators. It would have to go through both the inmates and camp guards and convince them that the Allies had liquidated the camp. That excuse, however, wouldn't go over very well unless the Allies were approaching the camp, in which case they would have likely liberated it anyway within a few days. All the Germans would have to do would find out that someone is convincing the guards to let the inmates go. If I were Hitler, I would have been very suspicious. I would have likely court-martialed the guards and replaced them with ones who were more loyal to the Nazi movement. Did you consider the possibility that the camp guards would have had a change of heart and let them go of their own volition? Dionysus nodded. It wouldn't work. Although many of the guards were probably uncomfortable with what they were doing, Hitler and the Nazis ruled partially on fear. These soldiers would have followed orders even if they didn't like them. After all, that's the soldiers' credo. One slip, and they could have found themselves going into the gas chambers instead of maintaining them. How about sabotaging the Zyklonby and replacing it with sleeping gas? Still won't work. All the Germans would have to do is check if the supposedly dead prisoners still had a pulse. That ruse wouldn't have lasted very long. Incidentally, this goes to show that we at least discuss the possibility many of the arguments that you've raised are valid and were brought up during the war. However, the lack of Oblivators partially doomed them from the get-go. Did you serve in the war, Ambassador? A haunted expression appeared on Dionysus's face. No, sir. However, I was alive at the time and remember the atrocities from the German occupation very well. I wanted to help, but my parents advised me not to get involved, as the Germans tended to butcher hundreds of civilians for every Nazi attacked. Look up massacres like the Holocaust of Kedros. I don't want to talk about it. It brings up very bad memories. Besides, it doesn't involve the Stein lawsuit. The American could tell immediately that Dionysus was uncomfortable here, so he got back on task. You said there were two major obstacles to freeing the inmates from the camps. The first was the fact that you would have had to obliviate all of the inmates and guards. What was the other one? Dionysus hesitated for a moment. Eventually, though, he let it out. Gellert Grindelwald. The American scratched his head. Who? Dionysus began pacing back and forth behind the podium. Gellert Grindelwald was a German dark wizard born in early 1880s in what was then known as Danzig. He was a colleague, and at one point a friend of Albus Dumbledore, the former Grand Mugwump and British Minister of Magic. He studied for a while at Durmstrang, but was eventually expelled because he was caught studying the dark arts too much for his own good. He eventually went back home and continued studying the dark arts on his own. He served on the Western Front during the First World War, where he learned very quickly, A, that a discreet impervious spell would protect him from mustard gas and bullets, and B, he would need a large number of mechanical or undead soldiers if he wanted to take over the world. Given all of the casualties on the Western Front, that was a logical conclusion, and he couldn't use living people because they tended to think for themselves and get killed. So he decided that he would create an army of inferi, undead creatures when it came to conquering the world. A believer in the Deathly Hallows, he understood that an artifact called the Resurrection Stone could be used to create inferi. So he went out of his way to steal the stone. While he was at it, he stunned a wizard named Gregorovich and got his hands on the Elder Wand as well. The Russian ambassador cut in. Elder Wand? You mean the thing the Death Eaters stole from Hogwarts a while back? Yes, this wand is extremely powerful and is well-nigh invincible in a magical duel. Supposedly, it is even strong enough to overwhelm Atlantis bubbles, though I'm not exactly hoping for confirmation. The American grunted. A wand which can beat Atlantis. Wonderful. Dionysus tried to reassure him. Don't worry, sir. There's only one Elder Wand. And it's in the hands of the Death Eaters. I'd say that's something to worry about. Dionysus shrugged. The Death Eaters are in disarray, as far as we can tell. One man with a powerful wand isn't going to do much, and we're going to do what we can to get it back. At any rate, back to the story. Grindelwald was similar to Voldemort, and Círdan for that matter, in that he believed that the wizards should rule the Muggles. His belief in the wizarding race's supremacy over the others led him into the study of social Darwinism. This, in turn, led him to study the writings of a fellow Western Front veteran by the name of Adolf Hitler. The American representative winced. A Nazi wizard? Oh, wonderful. Dionysus waved his hands noncommittally. Yes and no. The Nazis were German and Aryan supremacists, whereas Grindelwald was a wizarding supremacist who happened to be German. The important thing, however, was that when Hitler came to power in 1933 and briefed on the magical world around him, as one would have expected for a new head of state, Grindelwald introduced himself and explained that he was a wizard who was in favor of having the superior races rule the inferior races. Hitler was a bit wary at first, but a few magic tricks by Grindelwald convinced the Führer that Grindelwald knew what he was doing. So they agreed to a tentative alliance which would be worth its weight in gold in 1940, when discreet magical support helped the Germans plow through Western Europe and conquer everything but Britain. The British ambassador whistled. Are you telling me that Grindelwald used magic against us during the war? Dionysus shook his head. Almost. Grindelwald had considered it. However, he was wary of getting involved with England because that would drag in Albus Dumbledore, an extremely powerful wizard Grindelwald was reluctant to antagonize and/or fight. Besides, he didn't want Hitler getting too powerful, as at some point, Grindelwald would have to overthrow him as the head of the Reich. I'm surprised the German Ministry of Magic, groups like the Luftwaffe, and various generals accepted Grindelwald's support. Dionysus chuckled. They did, for a while. Most of the German ministry members were strong patriots, which meant that they tended towards the Nazi ideology, although to their credit, they refused to do anything to support the death camps. However, eventually the German ministry realized who they were dealing with. Once that happened, things fell apart swiftly. Having just signed off on what we know as Operation Sea Lion, a combined magical amphibious attack on the British Isles, they warned the Führer that Grindelwald was an evil wizard who wanted to take over the world. Hitler immediately requested that the Ministry of Magic get rid of Grindelwald. The German wizards began doing so and dropped all support for the German military, much to Hitler's chagrin. But the wizards convinced them that Grindelwald was too dangerous to allow free. This meant that Operation Sea Lion was going to have problems, as there was no way that the invasion would work without magical support. To make matters worse, one of the German army generals, who hadn't realized that there was going to be magical support, supposedly reported to Hitler that many of his men were concerned that Sea Lion would be a disaster. Realizing that without the wizards the invasion was hopeless, Hitler called off the attack. This, ladies and gentlemen, is why the Nazis never invaded England and why the D-Day invasion worked. Now, back to the subject at hand. Grindelwald decided to entertain himself by taking advantage of the chaos in Europe to do the type of things Voldemort tended to do. Attack Muggles and blame the Russians, Jews, Germans, Japanese, etc. Terrorize wizards, and so forth. Atlantis couldn't do anything at the time as it was at DEFCON 3 during most of the Second World War, getting to DEFCON 2 only after the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. However, it recommended that the free world send any free wizards to fight and capture Grindelwald. Atlantis summed it up. That, my friends, took up most of our resources. That is why we didn't have anyone left to free the death camps. Atlantis couldn't intervene, and the wizards who could intervene were dealing with Grindelwald. Atlantis probably would have intervened, but by law it couldn't unless it was at DEFCON 2 or higher, at which point the war in Europe was over. There was a long pause. Finally, the American whistled. This could very well be a case where ignorance was bliss. Is it just me, or should we say that the existence of Grindelwald should be considered a state secret and not leave this room? Everyone nodded, and the American turned back to Atlantis. Whatever happened to Grindelwald? Dumbledore fought him in a classic duel and eventually defeated him. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and placed in a jail he himself created. As far as I know, he's still there, thinking about his actions at the age of 113. There were murmurs in the crowd. He's still alive. Yes, recall that wizards tend to live longer than Muggles. However, you can rest assured that he isn't breaking out of there. Grindelwald himself saw to that when he made the prison. The German ambassador's eyes narrowed. I'm surprised you didn't execute him. He would almost certainly have stood trial at Nuremberg for war crimes. Atlantis paused for a moment, then shrugged. Being trapped with powerful magical guardians in your home for 5 decades is a fate worse than death, from what I've been told. Trust me, sir. He deserves this form of imprisonment. Execution would be a blessing in a case like this. Chapter 456. See it fly. Thursday, December 5, 199,610 to 50 Lecture Hall, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Cambridge. Atlantis DEFCON status. 345% next up. World War won't. Jelena Kurchatova tapped her wand on the blackboard, and the wand motions underlying the transfiguration spell appeared on the blackboard. She was grateful that she didn't have to write that out all by herself anymore. She pointed at the board. Take a look at this sequence of wand movements. Do you see anything familiar about them? One of the students in the front of the room raised his hand, and Kurchatova called on him. It's the same swish and flick that was used with the sleep spell. Correct. Why would that be? Another student answered that. Probably because the swish and flick is necessary to concentrate magical energy. Have any experiments been done to determine at one point the energy flows into the wand? Kurchatova smiled. 2 points for East Campus. You're right on, my friend. Several scientists have done experiments with gravimeters now that we know that magic is powered by a form of repulsive gravity. A good 85% of the gravitational effects seem to occur during the initial swish and flick. Clearly, this motion was designed to strengthen the effects of the spell about to be cast. But how does that motion do that? Does the energy flow down into the wand when the wand is pointed up? If so, why doesn't that happen more often? Kurchatova shrugged. To be honest, we don't know. No one has ever done a scientific investigation of magic before. If you choose to go course 19, you could get a chance to do your own magic lab and find out. All right, we now know what the first half of the spell does. Now comes part 2. This spell, whose wand motion has been written on the blackboard, transfigures the target into what? A girl in the back of the room raised her hand. A cat. I think it's going transfigure it into a cat. Kurchatova was expecting this. What makes you say that? Because it seems to trace out the shape of a cat's head. I suspect that you have to wave the wand in a way which traces out the form the object is supposed to take. Kurchatova smiled. A reasonable conclusion. However, that is in fact not the case. The second half of the spell is a motion which indicates this is a transfiguration spell. This particular spell actually can be used to change it into a dog, fish, mouse, Athena workstation. Anything. All of them use the same wand motion. But how can that be? Simple. At the time you finish the wand motion, you're supposed to think about what you want to transform the target into. Envision it in your mind's eye, and that's how you do it. She erased the lesson from the blackboard. This goes to show two things. First, the swish and flick is used in virtually all spells to gather magical energy. Second, you can have a lot of false cognates when it comes to reverse engineering a spell from its wand motion. All of you were convinced that it transfigured the target into a cat. However, that was not the case. Magical incantations aren't always what they seem. One of the girls was watching the lesson with rapt attention. Kurchatova understood why, of course. In a class with 500 people, the odds favored about 5 or so being Q-only wizards. Sure enough, 4 of them had managed to grasp the wand without being harmed. Tentatively, the Q-only witch raised her hand. "Professor, can I try?" Kurchatova looked at her warily. Transfiguration is a pretty complicated spell, and it's easy to mess up. The girl lifted her pencil and showed it to the crowd. "I think I know how it works. I'm going to try to run this pencil into a crayon. That's a small enough change that it could work even for me." Kurchatova explained that traditionally students weren't supposed to use magic outside school for a reason. However, she didn't get far before her voice was drowned out by her students chanting, "Go, go, go." It was obvious that they would keep on nagging her until she gave in. Eventually, she threw up her hands and handed over the wand. "All right, Jill, one try, and I want you facing away from the rest of us in case you blow up half the blackboard." The girl stared hard at the pencil and then pointed the wand at it. Taking a deep breath, she shouted, "Burnt sienna, here I come." There was a flash of light, and the pencil disappeared. In its place was what appeared to be a wooden stick. It wasn't a crayon, and it certainly wasn't a pencil anymore. But she had done something, at least. Excited, she showed the stick around the room. "Look what I did." "It's not a crayon, but it's not a pencil anymore. How about that?" The people whooped it up for a few minutes as Kurchatova put her head in her hands. Kurchatova took her wand back and said, "All right, Jill. That's enough for now. If you want to practice transfiguration, do it somewhere where you can actually concentrate." Jill's eyes brightened. "Does next house get a few points for this?" Kurchatova shook her head. "Casting the spell is not part of the official course curriculum, so no. However, I must say that you got further than I thought you would." She turned back to the class. "All right then, where were we?" She continued the lecture as people all around Jill started congratulating her. Jill's elation, however, diminished greatly when she realized that she was missing something. Sheepishly, she turned to the boy next to her. "I'll go out with you, if you give me something to write with." Kurchatova rolled her eyes, conjured up a pencil, and threw it over to Jill. Jill caught it one-handed and started taking notes, much to the chagrin of no fewer than 3 boys who were waving pencils in her face. She looked up at the back of them, where a good 2-3 of her sorority sisters were taking the class. She may have graduated, but she still spent a lot of time on campus with the rest of the girls. On a whim, all of them were wearing their SIF shirts. Although the official call letters of the sorority weren't actually SIF after all, there was no F in Greek. The SIF had started out as a joke when Kurchatova had taken each freshman pledge candidate out on her broom for a ride. One of the girls had shouted down to the rest of group, "See, it flies." That had just opened the floodgates for more SIF acronyms. See it fly, see I fly, shit I fell, and so forth. Many of the pledges were pressuring Kurchatova and the rest of the founders into changing the sorority to be one based on fans of magic. However, the founders weren't going for that. The sorority had been founded to fill a niche at MIT which had not been covered by current Greek system, and it was important for the women in that niche to have a place to belong to. The illusory cuckoo clock hanging over the blackboard started chirping, indicating that the class was at an end. Dismissing the cuckoo clock, She announced the latest and final problem set topics for the semester, waiting to make sure everyone, or at least most of the people, in the room had gotten the information. She grabbed her broom and made her way out of the room. She had gotten midway through her own grad student work when Jill made her way into the room. "All right, Professor. I really want to learn how to cast spells. You will be able to help me, right?" Kurchatova shook her head. "Jill, listen to me. I'm extremely busy. I'm teaching a class and am taking my own grad student classes at the same time. I have to take care of the students here in Russian House, where I'm their Aunt Jelena. I'm still on the board of Guinevere's Flying Carpets, though Jason and Guinevere have more or less taken over while I'm in school. I barely have time as is. Can't you get a time turner?" There are restrictions on time turner use, which means there is no way I'll be able to get my hands on one. Besides, I don't want to cause any time paradoxes and get myself killed. Time turners are dangerous and should only be used by trained professionals, like those in Atlantis. Jill pouted for a moment before something occurred to her. Maybe I can take classes in Enfield with the Quabbin Academy of Sorcery. Kurchatova blinked, then stared at her thoughtfully. "You know, that might not be a bad idea. Do all four of you want to learn how to cast spells?" Jill nodded. "Yes, we all do. And we know how to get there. Just head down to Park Street on the T and head down that new I-entry corridor. Once we're there, take the flying carpet down 32B to Enfield. There's got to be something there which will allow us to get through the water to the city." Kurchatova frowned. "There are several options. I'd recommend the Muggle Apparition Network. Supposedly they're going to have a man near the Quabbin Attack Memorial as well. Talk to them and have them send you over there on my authority. The headmistress of the CAS will almost certainly listen to you. Tell him that King William has been able to become a wizard and that you want to follow in his footsteps." Jill let out a girlish laugh. "You really think they'll take us?" "Absolutely. For one thing, Hogwarts has already set a precedent. For another, there are going to be a lot of openings over the next few years due to the deaths of students in Greenwich and Dana. Believe me, Jill, you'll get in." Chapter 457, De-Escalation. Thursday, December 5, 1996, Oval Office, White House, Washington, DQ, United States of America. Atlantis DEFCON status. 336% next up. Charlie's even more on the MTA. Bill Clinton looked at Secretary Ariadne and swore. "Are you sure about this, Ariadne?" Ariadne nodded. "I'm afraid so. Silesia has closed its borders to Americans because of the way we're interfering with Círdan. The Salal ambassador is hoping that we'll be able to resolve this diplomatically. We haven't done anything to Silesia. If anything, the Antarctic scientists have enjoyed talking with the Salal. Are Círdan and Silesia allies? I can't see them as being allies, as the Salal seem to respect Muggles." Ariadne explained. "Remember Silesia's history. This particular nation was founded by wizards who were fleeing Western imperialism and colonialism. They wanted to keep their way of life and were concerned that their culture, along with that of the native population, would be subsumed in the name of progress." Clinton's eyes widened. "They think that we're trying to take over Círdan, make it an American colony, and impose American values." Ariadne nodded. "That's correct, Mr. President." Clinton grimaced. "We all know that Círdan has some quirks which most of the world isn't particularly keen on. From what I've been told, they're a bit of a pariah state themselves for that reason. However, much as I would like to reform them, I'm not planning on taking them over. We've already got enough problems here with the recession and so forth. Haven't you told the Salal that?" Ariadne looked at him helplessly. "I have, Mr. President, and the Salal don't believe us. They've already pointed out that someone, presumably a Western nation, has forced the Salal to make some pro-Muggle reforms. And it wasn't Nestor, their traditional rival. The Salal probably don't know we reformed Salal. However, I wouldn't be surprised if Círdan tells them at some point. From the vantage point of the Salal, it's classic American imperialism." Clinton groaned. You're thinking Silesia is going to ally with Círdan and escalate the war if we actively get involved. Ariadne nodded slowly. That's a distinct possibility, Mr. President. As long as it's just Círdan and Nestor duking it out, nothing really is going to happen. Those two countries have been fighting for God knows how long, and this spat isn't particularly unusual. What is unusual, however, is the fact that there's a chance of escalation thanks to American intervention. And this is what I've come to talk to you about. Clinton looked at her intently. I'm listening. Ariadne drew a deep breath. Mr. President, I think we're going to have to get out of this somehow. I know we promised help to Nestor. However, if we get involved, there is a strong possibility that a local war could go worldwide. This could be a wizarding World War Roman III if we continue to actively pressure Círdan. Clinton blinked. What? Ariadne looked at the president gravely. Simple. We attack Círdan. Silesia gets involved and goes after us, and the merpeople harassing Nestor start attacking our coastlines as well. You've seen what wizards can do. Magical terror attacks when we're out of position can wreak havoc on Muggles who aren't expecting them. A NATO country is attacked, so Europe starts going nuts. Think of Desert Storm but worse, and with wizards. Clinton whistled. Damn. Ariadne continued. The merpeople decide to play U-boat and start attacking Muggle shipping in the Atlantic. At the very least, they try to blockade us like they did Nestor. Oil prices hit $8 a gallon, and the economy crumbles further. Europe gets dragged in, especially if European ships are targeted and they lose one of their major trading partners. NATO mobilizes. Círdan, the merpeople surrounding Nestor, and Silesia then try to ally with the Gulliver consortium, arguing that Muggles are overstepping their boundaries again and attacking wizards. The Pacific goes up. Hawaii falls, and for all we know Japan and Taiwan do as well. Just go on from there, and consider the fact that wizards are very good at apparating. Oh, and did I forget to mention, we can't use the Judgment Day protocol again until June 2001. Clinton gritted his teeth. Double damn. Ariadne leaned towards the president. This reminds me a lot of 1914, with a lot of alliances and global economics hooking everyone together. The initial attack by Nestor on Círdan could have very well been the equivalent of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. You know what happened next, sir? There is only one way to prevent a major international conflict. This has to stay a wizard-only struggle. The American armed forces can't get involved. Clinton stared out the window, his brow creased with thought. We have to do something, however. Nestor has asked for our help, and the United States doesn't renege on promises. I'm aware of that, Mr. President. We'll help, but we're going to do so in a way which is not military. Clinton looked at her, intrigued. Oh, what are you thinking? Ariadne smiled. I have reason to believe that the merpeople blockading Nestor aren't working for the Archon. The Archon? Who's that? The Archon is the king of the merpeople. But think about it for a second, sir. We've got a trade blockade of a possible American ally. At the same time, the Kodiak station is having brisk trade between the merpeople and the Americans. Something seems out of place here. What's even more interesting is that the merpeople's ambassador has told us several times that the Archon didn't order the attack on Nestor. I'm a good judge of faces, at least with humans, and I'm convinced that he's telling the truth. It makes sense. There are almost certainly a few wizard supremacists, or at least human Muggle haters, in the merpeople's community. They decide to ally with Círdan since they both don't like human Muggles. Círdan, of course, thinks they speak for the Archon and accept their help. Clinton thought for a moment. You're thinking we should issue a formal request to the Archon to have him pull his wayward countrymen out of Nestor by force, and we'll then leave the scene, having fulfilled our promise to Nestor. Ariadne nodded. That's exactly my thought, sir. Here's what I envision happening. We tell the merpeople to clean up their act. They get embarrassed a little, but they soon realize that we're right. The Archon's forces take out the rogue merpeople as we leave the scene. Once we stop acting like an imperial power, Silesia backs down. This leaves only two combatants left, Círdan and Nestor, just like we've always had. Clinton thought about this some more. Slowly, he nodded. It makes sense. However, Nestor isn't going to be happy about this. I doubt they would have attacked Círdan on their own. Don't be so sure about that, Mr. President. Nestor has always welcomed outsiders, and the few Muggles it has been able to get its hands on after all, in a land with a good 2:1 ratio of women to men, where a baby's supposed to come form. These two countries have been going after it for many years now. Come to think of it, I have reason to believe that several of the disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle were actually either Círdan slave captures or Muggle ships caught up in the battle between the two states. Yes, and with our luck, Nestor will decide to punish us for not helping them. I doubt it, sir. Why would Nestor open a two-front war? Antagonizing us won't do anything about the fight with Círdan. Nestor started it, Secretary Ariadne. Markali has her troops on foreign soil. Nestor can always pull back out. Ariadne groaned. Sir, we've thought about this a lot. This is the best solution by far. We're more than willing to risk of Nestor's displeasure if this action is going to stop a potential world war. You know enough about human history to realize that Muggles, wizards, and wars don't mix. Hell, the last time magical weapons were loosed on the Muggle world, we had a judgment day, and that was one wizard. One wizard. Clinton thought a little more. Have you spoken with Radner about this? Ariadne nodded. We haven't spoken with him much since he's technically in retirement from major political duties. However, we talked to him a couple of days ago, and he fully agrees with this plan. Clinton stood as he made up his mind. All right, let's do it. Send a message to the Rattle ambassador and have him meet the two of us here in 3 hours. See if you can get a promise out of Rattle to have the Archon's regular forces blockade Círdan, as long as the merpeople are blockading Nestor. Ariadne nodded. We'll do what we can, so thank you for your support. Chapter 458, Rock Worm Ruckus. Friday, December 6, 1996, Charles Street Station, Blue Line Tunnel, Massachusetts, Bay Transportation Authority, Boston, United States of America, Atlantis, DEFCON status. 336% next up. How about giving them time turners? Take Roman 2. Michael Hobbs looked over the beginnings of the new terminal and nodded. The rockworm had, much to the MBTAR's surprise, done an admirable job. The tunnel was more or less waterproof and seemed to be sturdy enough to support the weight of Cambridge Street above it. The wizards had managed to pack down the dirt on the walls, ceiling, and floor of the tunnel so it wouldn't be filled with dust when the first trains went through. As far as he could tell, construction was proceeding only a day or so behind schedule. However, it was still early in the project, and he had a strong suspicion that the state of Massachusetts was going to throw a big monkey wrench into the proceedings. The wizards had taken Jeff, the rockworm, over to South Station to start working on the North-South Rail Link Tunnel. The creature did his job, as usual. However, there had been a couple of minor snags which had made the news. First, a large sinkhole had opened up in Chinatown when the unstable landfill, which made up much of Boston, had caved in and swallowed a good portion of Curve Street. The wizards supervising the construction had plugged the hole pretty quickly. Unfortunately, one of the brownstones had partially collapsed, and the residents had spent a good half-hour screaming at the wizards in Chinese. The wizards had been forced to spend a good $10,000 fixing the building, and another 2 hours helping the residents put their belongings back in place. That Chinatown incident, however, had been nothing compared to the disaster earlier today in the financial district, when Jeff managed to eat up a large electrical transformer buried underground. Not only had power been shorted out for a good 3 hours this morning, but the electric shock had spooked Jeff to the point where he'd backed out of his tunnel and right into the South Station railroad platform, in plain sight of the Muggles waiting for the commuter rail and Amtrak. There had been a brief riot, as the train passengers had run in fear of the humongous creature, and no fewer than 2 cars had been derailed in the animal's panic. Although the wizards had managed to fix everything by the evening rush hour, commuter rail service had been delayed, and people were screaming that using monsters to complete the big dig hadn't been what they had been expecting. The wizards explained that the monsters occasionally did get out of control for a few minutes here and there, and that these particular creatures had been behaving about as well as could be expected in such an environment. They insisted that everything would be all right, and that the wizards would repair any damage to Boston's infrastructure during the construction. The wizards' opponents, on the other hand, argued that it was only a matter of time until one of those animals crushed or ate somebody, and as everyone knew by now, even wizards could not reverse death. What a mess, though, Hobbs. However, the simple fact been that the introduction of the worms to dig some of the smaller tunnels had been a pilot program for the most part. There had been no major incidents working on the Blue Line extension, and only 2 working on the north-south rail link. Whether the program would be extended to cover the main I-93 tunnel would depend on the results of these trials. The wizards had told Menino that they intended to continue the trials, and they had convinced Menino and the MBTA that it was safe. Unfortunately, Menino was being deluged with requests to get rid of the rock worms and have humans dig the tunnels. Once the tunnels were dug, then the wizards could do whatever they wanted. The concerned citizens also demanded that no monsters be used at any other point in the project. Wizard Kershaw had explained that it would be possible to send Jeff back to the 4 towns and continue the construction using ordinary wizards. However, he warned the city that the cost would increase by about $2 billion and that construction would take an additional 12 months. It would be up to the citizens of Boston to decide between the cost increase and the worms. In either case, however, it would be cheaper than going with Bechtel Parsons. Hobbs hoped they stayed with the worms and finished the project on schedule for a change. The worms hadn't done anything to him, after all, and he found the idea of the tunnels being dug out by animals somewhat amusing. However, he suspected that the referendum on March 1st would determine that the worms had to go. After all, Boston was accustomed to cost increases and delays with the big dig. How would this be any different? Park Street Station. Jill led the other 3 Q-only wizards from 19 off the shuttle bus, which had replaced the Red Line, and made their way over to the entrance to Park Street. She and the 3 guys had been waiting at Kendall for a long time, ringing those musical sculptures in the station, when the public address system reported that there had been an incident at South Station, and the Red Line was going to be replaced with shuttle buses for the next 3 hours. There were rumors running around that one of the rock worms had run amok and had managed to make its way into South Station, terrorizing a few passengers and causing damage before being subdued. She didn't know how to react to that. Had it not been a case where people had been frightened and possibly injured, it would have sounded like a headline from a bad movie. Huge worm from Dungeons and Dragons attacks people in train station. She had a strong suspicion that Wizard Kershaw's plan for the big dig would have to be redeveloped or scrapped completely. She chuckled. The big dig, she thought. What a disaster. Anyone who majored in courses 1 or 11, civil engineering or urban studies, would probably make it big in Boston. There were several streetlights out in the area for some reason, presumably damage from the worms. Fortunately, the entrance to Park Street was still illuminated. With Kerchetova's wand in hand, she led them down into the terminal and stopped outside the door to I-entry in the Winter Street concourse. Professor Kerchetova had mixed feelings about letting the 4 trainees borrow the wand. On one hand, holding the wand would prove once, and for all that these 4 candidates were in fact Q-only wizards. On the other hand, the young professor who had supposedly just graduated last year had been concerned that one of the gang of 4 would try to do something with the wand without her supervision. All 4 had promised to behave, but Jill herself had to confess that one of the boys seemed a bit eager. The door to eye entry was closed. However, Kurchatova had told Jill what to do: step up and tap the wand on the door. The door disappeared, and the four candidates made their way into the corridor. All four of them marveled at the worm-hewn walls and the glowing names which had been permanently etched into them. Alex, the sophomore, gasped when he saw the name of one of his friends who had been killed in H entry. It had taken the group a good 2 or 3 minutes to console him. The corridor eventually opened out into a large park with a couple of reflecting pools. This must be the Quabbin Memorial, she thought. If that was the case, yes, there were the flying carpets just outside the dome, and next to them was a man with a Muggle Apparition Network uniform. The man-employee looked up for a moment, saw that Jill was holding a wand, and turned back to his book. She led the group over to the man-employee, who put down his book with a sigh of relief. "May I help you?" Jill nodded. "Quite possibly. The four of us are Qonli wizards. Professor Jelena Kurchatova has recommended that we go to the 4 towns to see if anyone would be willing to train us over IAP. Hopefully, this will set a precedent for training American Qonli wizards, much like they do in England." The man-agent blinked. IAP. MIT intercession, taking up most of January. Ideally, we'd like to learn as much as we can within 2 weeks of immersive study. That way, we'll be able to spend at least some time at home. The agent frowned. "I'll be able to take you there, of course. However, you must understand that training to become a wizard takes years. You'll barely be able to cast simple spells with 2 weeks of training." Jill drew a deep breath and brought out a half-transfigured pencil. "I've already partially transfigured a pencil into a crayon." Professor Kurchatova drew the wand motion on the blackboard, and I tried to follow it. The agent stared at the pencil with a dubious expression on his face. "All right, I'll send you over there. However, don't expect much. You won't be able to get into the CAS until next fall at the earliest, and even if you do so, you'll have to take classes both at MIT and the CAS. I don't know much about MIT, but from what I've been told, it is at least as difficult a school as the CAS. At best, you'll be able to get a personal tutor. Come to think of it, why can't you have Kurchatova teach you?" Kurchatova's extremely busy with her own work as a teacher. She is also a graduate student there as well as a dorm housemaster. She recommended some of Guinevere's friends as possible tutors. The man-agent looked even more dubious. "Guinevere's friends are as young as she is. I doubt they're experienced enough to be tutors. They help teach 19 from time to time." "Yes, and that's a basic magic course for Muggles. They're talking about the magical world, not actually trying to teach magic. Although I suppose they'll take you after 19 ends. Be advised you won't learn much." Jill grunted. "It's more than we know right now." The man-agent scratched his head. "True, so I guess it can't hurt. All right, you four. $10 each, and I'll transport you one at a time to the CAS." The headmistress of the CAS looked at the 4 MIT students thoughtfully. "Kurchatova's right, of course. You probably should be tutored. Otherwise, your magic might get out of control and harm people." Jill stared at her. "Harm people? Have strange things tended to happen to you, and you don't know why they do so? Do you ever feel like, when you get into trouble, you always manage to get through despite the obstacles?" Jill nodded slowly. "Yes, however, I figured it's because we're bright and clever." "Sometimes it is. Sometimes, however, it's because of magic. Magic will always resonate within you, even if you don't have a wand. Remember that several spells, such as apparition, don't require wand use. In fact, many cultures don't even use wands. Next time you find something unusual happening, pay close attention to it. It could be a magical instinct or talent manifesting itself." "I see. So will one of your staff members be able to tutor us during the winter? We don't have much money, but we may be able to help by providing you with Muggle technology for your school." The headmistress seemed amused. "Muggle technology? What will we do with it when we have magic?" All 4 MIT students chuckled. "You'd be surprised, headmistress. Computers are very powerful nowadays." The headmistress paused a little, then shrugged. Well, I suppose I should keep an open mind. All right, if you teach someone here how to use a computer and bring a computer with you, we'll give you lessons over the 2nd and 3rd weeks of January. I see you already have wands, so you're already ahead of the game. Alex cawed discreetly. Actually, we don't. This is Kirchetova's wand. We borrowed it to get in the door. I see. Well, in that case, you're going to have to buy wands when you first begin lessons. We're not giving you any wands before then, and you are not to experiment with Kirchetova's. Be advised that they can run hundreds of dollars, though from what I've been told of college tuition, that's just a drop in the bucket. Is that so? All 4 students nodded sharply. They'd be paying off student loans for a long time, unless being a wizard made them more marketable. Good. I'll make the necessary arrangements here. Meet me outside the door to eye-entry the Sunday of the 2nd week of January at 9:00. If after 2 weeks you wish to continue, we'll talk about renewing your lessons in the summer and expanding the program to cover more Q-only wizards. To be honest, I'm not sure where we're going to put all of you. We don't have rundown monasteries like they do in England, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Chapter 459, Debut of the Lacewing. Friday, December 6, 1996, Ford Headquarters, Dearborn, me United States of America. Atlantis DEFCON status. 336% next up. This has got to be cheating, but I don't see how it still sure looks a hell of a lot like a Ford Taurus, thought Judd Kincaid. He knew, however, that it in effect was a Ford Taurus with a few minor modifications. The biggest of these, of course, had been the flying enchantment. The cars were coming off the assembly line faster than the wizards could enchant them and make enough cosmetic changes to make it look like a magical car. As a result, most of them were sold as is, with the Taurus chassis and name. At present, only 1 of every 10 or so would actually get the flight modifications and be sold under the Lacewing brand. However, that would likely change as house witches, CWI employees, and unemployed spellcasters started working to enchant the cars for money. The engineers at Ford hadn't had to do much work to figure out how to adapt a car for flight. All they had done was read up on the Bentley Pegasus and imitate what they did. Turning the steering wheel into an aircraft-style control stick had been relatively simple, as had been adding parachutes to the roof. The wizards had told Ford that the parachutes weren't necessary, as the flying enchantment was pretty stable. However, the president of Ford had insisted. Otherwise, the government would have probably intervened and prevented the company from selling the Lacewings. The president of Ford had reported that approximately 1 out of every 2,000 cars on the road today now had flight capability. The most common flying car in the United States was, of course, the DeLorean Aviator. There were a few Pegasi running around, but not many due to the vehicle's high cost. Lotus was supposedly working on a flying car as well, but they were way behind Ford at the moment. And if everything went as planned, they'd be behind for a long, long time. The president of Ford looked at Kincaid and frowned. I thought Wizard Dresden would be here at the announcement. He did most of the planning, didn't he? Kincaid nodded. He did. However, he's a pretty busy man. We recently had a string of serial curses in the Chicago area, and Dresden was pretty busy dealing with that. He's all been busy trying to tell Jim Butcher what he can and cannot announce to the Muggles. He told me to convey his regrets, however. I'll be his representative. The president of Ford jerked his head at the car, which was at the center of a brightly lit room with the Lacewing logo hovering overhead. Reporters and photographers were taking their first looks at a vehicle which would likely revolutionize the American automotive industry. Do you know how to fly this thing? Yes, in fact, I did a few test flights myself. The tricky part was learning to drive it. I haven't driven cars much. It took me a while to get accustomed to the pedals and so forth. Well, maybe at the demo I'll drive it around and you fly it around. We'll stop for a moment so we can change seats before we go airborne. Got it. Kincaid nodded. Got it. Good. Let's get on with the announcement. Sounds good to me. The two men made their way to the podium and told the photographers hovering around the car to take their seats. Once everybody had been settled, the company president began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming this afternoon. I am the president of Ford, and with me is a representative of the Chicago Wizarding Institute, Wizard Jard Kincaid. It is our pleasure to introduce to you the future of the American mass-produced automobile, the 1997 Ford Lacewing. It has got all of the standard features one would have expected from a Ford product, a chassis based on the Taurus, responsive handling, airbags, and so forth. However, it has one feature which is virtually unique among cars today. Wizard Dresden, if you would do the honors. Kincaid nodded and got into the car. He turned the key in the ignition and honked the horn at the crowd. Then he grinned and pulled back on the steering wheel. The crowd gasped as the car rose into the air, and he made a couple of victory laps around the room. He then headed over to the middle of the room, the car hovering a few feet over the guests' heads. The Ford representative continued to speak. In case you haven't noticed, it can fly. No, it doesn't look like a fancy British model or like a science fiction time machine. However, it doesn't cost a fortune either. Unlike other flying vehicles you may be acquainted with, the Lacewing's MSRP starts at $18,995. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. You can get your own flying vehicle for under $20,000. Granted, it's a little more expensive than a typical Ford vehicle. However, imagine the respect and prestige you will earn when you're the only person on your block able to fly out of traffic jams and get to your destination in less than half the time you would have otherwise. And it is much less expensive than the competitors, where you are likely paying for the fact that their cars look like time machines. There are already over 1,000 Lacewings ready to be driven or flown off dealership floors. More of them are coming off the assembly line every day, being produced in the factories which have spent decades perfecting the Taurus. We at Ford believe that this vehicle will change the way people use their cars. The first Skyway, Massachusetts State Route 32B, has already been created and has been a hit with wizards and people who own flying carpets. There are going to be more of those in the future, express lanes dedicated for flying vehicles. Right now, 1 out of every 2,000 cars on the road flies. We believe that by the time the new century come around, 2001, that ratio will be up to 1 in 30 or higher. By 2005, 1 in 10. By 2015, 1 in 4. The crowd chattered excitedly as the Ford man continued. In addition to this new product, we at Ford would like to announce our new wheels to wings conversion program, which will take an existing vehicle and make it flight-worthy. The program will include 2 months of training and full flight enchantments. It will cost $4,995 to convert a Ford vehicle, $6,995 to convert a vehicle made by other American companies, and $9,995 to convert a foreign vehicle. Kincaid chuckled to himself, considering that the actual cost to convert an existing car was maybe $750, the parachute, the wizard-aided steering modifications, and a few enchantments. Ford was going to make a killing with this. And if someone else tried to undercut Ford on the price, the conversion package could drop even further. The president of Ford smiled. I vaguely recall a movie where a teenager and a scientist built a time machine that looked suspiciously like one of our competitors and traveled to the year 2015. When they arrived in 2015, they found themselves flying in the middle of a busy skyway with a large number of flying vehicles. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks to the fall of the statute of secrecy, that fantastic future is about to become a reality. And Ford, as usual, is going to be a key player in making that dream come true. I'll now answer some questions from the audience. Lou Herald Pharmaceutical Corporation. Lou Herald looked at his aide in confusion. What? How can that be? That's impossible. No one knows that we've been working on trying to recreate the Philosopher's Stone. Granted, we haven't gotten very far, but still. The aide nodded. I'm aware of that, sir. However, he knew about it, and he mentioned something on the phone about giving us possible magical assistance and significant financial compensation. Harold gaped. You've gotten in touch with a wizard, and he's going to be able to help us out. I believe so, sir. His name is Ernesto Dippet. Judging from what he's told me, I am fairly certain that he knows a lot about the Philosopher's Stone, even though he's not an alchemist. Harold grunted. If he's not an alchemist, what good is he going to do? I doubt that every single wizard studies alchemy, and we need an alchemy to make the stone. The aide grinned. I'm not so sure about that. Like I said, I'm fairly certain that this man knows a lot about the stone. Harold raised an eyebrow at his aide. And how would you know that? The aide laughed. Simple, sir. He's 331 years old. Harold gaped at him. You mean to tell me Flamel supplied him with the elixir of life, or does he have a stone himself? The former, sir. Nevertheless, I highly recommend that we listen to this guy. I agree. Well done, my friend. Where does he live? Spain, sir. Get him over here, pronto. Yes, sir. Nestor, Gabrielle didn't understand what had happened. One moment, the island of Nestor had been ringed with merpeople threatening the Nestorians with exotic weapons. The next moment, they had all been gone. All she had heard were some hideous screeching sounds. It was obvious someone in that group was upset. The head merman had hollowed out something which must have been an order, and the rest of the group had packed up and left. Where had they gone? Gabrielle didn't know. Hopefully, they wouldn't just reappear on the far side of the island. She knew one thing for certain. If the soldiers had left for good and the Merperson invasion was over, she would go back to civilian life. She really looked forward to taking care of this child. Hopefully, Senor Henriques would be able to help out as well. The only fly in the ointment, of course, was the fact that the war with Círdan was still going on. From what she'd been told, the invasion had bogged down, and they were running out of Muggle weapons. She really hoped that she wouldn't be sent to Nestor as part of the medical wing.